A black woman was humiliated in a jiu-jitsu class, mocked openly by the head coach in front of an entire room of students and visiting instructors, not for what she did, but simply for who she was. No mistakes. No missteps. Just a quiet presence in the wrong body, at the wrong time, in a place that pretended to be inclusive until it wasn't. It started when she entered the room with nothing but a white belt, an old GI, and a calm silence that some men interpret as weakness. She had no flashy entrance, no applause, no friends around her, just a focused mind and a respectful nod to every person she passed. But the moment she stepped on that mat, everything changed. The academy was buzzing that afternoon, big names were in the building. Guest instructors from a prestigious affiliate had flown in. Cameras were being set up. Content was being created. This was the day to show off. Everyone knew it. And she picked the worst possible moment to be invisible. The instructor, a man used to commanding the space with arrogance, scanned the room and then paused at her. He tilted his head slightly, narrowed his eyes, and smirked. His voice was loud enough for everyone to hear, and filled with the casual cruelty of someone who thinks they're untouchable. "You," he said, pointing directly at her without even using her name, "let's have you sit this one out, yeah? Don't want to confuse our guests with random people off the street." He laughed. Some others chuckled too, nervously. She didn't respond. Just nodded, walked to the corner, and sat. Still. Silent. Processing. Then came the second blow, louder this time, aimed right at her identity. "Or maybe you can hand out water bottles later, help out. That's more your speed, isn't it?" He smiled like he was making a joke. The guests looked confused. Some embarrassed. But nobody spoke. Cameras rolled. The humiliation, immortalized in 4K. That's how it began, not with a fight, but with a dismissal. The kind that slices deeper than any chokehold. The kind that reminds you you're not just being excluded, you're being erased. She sat on the edge of the mat as others paired off, drilled movements, smiled for the visiting coaches. She didn't cry. She didn't flinch. She didn't even look angry. But something in her posture changed. Something very subtle. Her breathing shifted. Her spine straightened. Her eyes stopped wandering. She locked in. What no one in that room knew, not the cocky purple belt showing off sweeps for Instagram, not the instructor with the polished shoes and dirty thoughts, not even the visiting black belts, was that this wasn't her first mat. This wasn't her first war. She had lived through years of them. But the difference was, in those battles, her opponents didn't wear GIs. They wore suits. Hospital badges. Police uniforms. And sometimes, like today, they wore friendly smiles that twisted into venom when no one was watching. She had wrestled through every system that told her no, the school board, the job market, the medical insurance office. Every time someone said she couldn't, she figured out how to make sure she did. But today it was different. Today, she didn't come to fight a system. She came to learn. And instead, she got dragged through mud. The instructor kept going. "You all see what happens when we let just anybody wear a GI, he shouted during a technique demo. "Now we gotta filter for quality, not charity." He laughed again. She still didn't move. But the visiting black belts began to shift uncomfortably. One of them leaned toward the head coach and whispered something, but he waved it off, eyes still locked on her like she was the problem in the room. One of the guests finally said aloud, "Is she not training?" The instructor replied, "Nah. She's not ready for this level." She stood. Quietly. Calmly. No emotion on her face. Walked toward the door, not to leave, but to get her bag. She untied the white belt from her waist. Looked at it for 1 second. Then put it down. The whispers started when she walked toward the center of the mat. A few white belts stepped aside. One blue belt mumbled, what is she doing? The coach stepped in, annoyed. I said you're not training today. She looked at him, not with anger, but with a sharp, focused stillness that silenced even the cameras. I heard you, she said. But I didn't ask for permission. I just came to train. Everyone froze. The moment held like a breath trapped between fear and awe. And then, as if choreographed by fate, one of the visiting instructors asked her, out loud, have you trained before? She didn't answer with words. She knelt down, tied a fresh belt she pulled from her bag, and nodded. Let's roll, she said. One of the visiting black belts smiled. Let's. That's when the room learned what the instructor had tried so hard to hide, what his ego refused to consider. Within seconds of the sparring round starting, she flowed into a takedown so smooth, so practiced, it looked like choreography. But it wasn't. It was real. It was control, power, and beauty all at once. The kind of takedown you only master through thousands of reps. She moved like water, transitioned like breath, and submitted the first opponent in less than 30 seconds. People were stunned. Then came the second round. A more experienced student, tapped in 45 seconds. By the third roll, no one was laughing anymore. Phones were out. Mouths were open. The same people who had chuckled earlier were now whispering, who is she? And when the instructor himself stepped in, anger hidden under fake composure, she didn't hesitate. No aggression. Just calm execution. One sweep. One pass. One choke. He tapped. Fast. He sat up, red-faced, staring at her like he'd just seen a ghost. She stood, breathing steady, then walked back toward her corner, picked up her white belt, and held it for a second. That's when one of the guests walked to the center of the mat, raised her hand, and said something no one saw coming, this woman shouldn't be wearing a white belt. She's a black belt in everything that matters. And I'm going to make sure she gets recognized today. The gym went silent. Cameras still rolling. The instructor, speechless. But the moment wasn't about him anymore. It was about a woman who was erased, then chose to write herself back in, not through rage, but through undeniable excellence. A woman who came to train and left everyone else trained in humility. But here's what no one could have guessed, what no one saw coming, not even the guest instructors, was why she moved like that. Why her takedowns were so effortless. Why her transitions had a fluidity only seen in elite competition. There was something deeper than passion behind those movements. Something most of them couldn't understand, until the truth came out. So what exactly was her secret? And how did a woman who walked into the gym as a complete stranger become the one person no one would ever forget? Stay with us until the end, because when you hear what she used to be before walking onto that mat, and why she never told anyone, you'll never look at a white belt the same way again. At Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against any form of racism, discrimination, or prejudice. To every black viewer listening right now, you are powerful, you are worthy, and your presence matters. This channel is a safe space for your voice, your stories, and your truth. Now sit back and enjoy this powerful story of resilience, justice, and a twist you won't see coming. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you believe in stories that make a difference. Her name was Aaliyah Moore, and she moved through the world like someone who had long ago stopped asking for space. She simply took it, quietly, without noise, without permission. At 32 years old, Aaliyah had learned the rhythm of invisibility in places where she was both present and unwanted. Raised in a modest suburb outside of Newark, New Jersey, she grew up in a world that taught her to be two things at once, strong enough to carry the weight of others' doubt, but gentle enough not to make anyone uncomfortable about it. Her voice, when used, was soft, controlled, calm, not because she didn't have rage, but because she learned the hard way that rage, when it came from women who looked like her, was always misread. She worked part-time at a physical therapy clinic and spent the rest of her week caring for her younger brother Malik, who had cerebral palsy and required full-time assistance. She didn't have the luxury of downtime, of hobbies, of the sweet indulgence of rest. But every Wednesday and Saturday night, she carved out exactly 90 minutes to train. Not to fight. Not to compete. Just to reclaim something that the world around her tried to chip away from her every single day, her center. When Aaliyah first walked into Ironground Jiu-Jitsu in the heart of Charlotte, North Carolina, it was already a place built on unspoken rules. The gym was located in a redeveloped warehouse space, all brick walls and industrial lights, with polished gray mats that carried the sharp smell of bleach and sweat. The people were lean, white, and loud. The conversations between roles were filled with friendly arrogance, talk of tournaments, injuries, rankings, and upcoming promotions. The head coach, Robert Lansing, was a tall, well-built man in his mid-40s with a black belt wrapped twice around his waist like a badge of superiority. He had a particular energy, the kind that drew admiration from new students and silence from older ones. His word was law. He liked control. He liked discipline. And he liked to feel like he owned the room. Aaliyah noticed it on her first visit, the way students looked at him with both respect and fear, the way he corrected people with humor that was always just slightly cutting. He didn't yell. He didn't need to. His dominance was quieter than that, more surgical. The gym moved when he moved. From the beginning, Aaliyah kept her head down. She filled out the forms. She nodded when spoken to. She showed up early, stayed late, and always bowed properly before stepping on the mat. She didn't draw attention to herself. She wore the same simple white gi every class, and her movements were efficient, not flashy. She asked few questions, but when she did, they were sharp, precise, the kind that made people pause. She rolled with everyone, regardless of size or belt, and tapped when it was time. She never boasted, never posted photos, never talked about her background. There were rumors, of course. One guy said he thought she used to box. Another swore she moved like a dancer. A few others claimed she had wrestling experience, but nobody knew for sure. Aaliyah never confirmed or denied anything. She didn't come there to explain herself. She came to train. And in a place where ego wore GIs and belts told stories, that silence unsettled people. Robert noticed her early on, but not in the way that mattered. To him, she was a curiosity, a student who didn't fit the mold. She wasn't there to be molded, either. And that made her both forgettable and dangerous in his eyes. She didn't flatter. She didn't linger after class. She didn't play the politics that so often turned mats into high school cafeterias. When promotions came around, Aaliyah was always passed over. Not because she lacked skill, that was obvious, but because Robert believed growth had to be earned not just through ability, but through allegiance. And she wasn't loyal to him. She was loyal to the art, to herself. That made her a problem. Over time, the distance between them grew colder. Robert didn't coach her as directly. He often skipped over her during technique demonstrations. When students praised her, he redirected the conversation. He never corrected her mistakes in public, but he also never acknowledged her growth. And in a gym where recognition was currency, being invisible was its own kind of punishment. Still, Aaliyah showed up. Week after week. Quietly. Focused. Patient. She didn't need his approval. But what she didn't know was that her very presence, her discipline, her calm, her refusal to play by the social rules of the gym, had started to eat away at Robert's control. And he didn't like it. It all came to a head on a Saturday afternoon when Ironground hosted a special seminar. 3 black belts from California were coming in for a training exchange, a chance for students to learn from new perspectives, and for the gym to show off its talent. The mats were packed. Cameras were set up. Students wore their best GIs, and there was a buzz in the air like something important was about to happen. Robert walked in like a general entering battle. Sharp posture, clean GI, nodding at the guests like they were diplomats. He called everyone to attention. Students lined up by rank. Aaliyah stood quietly at the far right, among the white belts, her belt worn thin at the edges but still white. One of the visitors, a Brazilian instructor with a calm, open energy, introduced himself and began showing a sweep. Students partnered up. Aaliyah looked around, waiting for a nod or a gesture from someone. No one came. She started to move toward a younger blue belt, but before she could, Robert's voice cut through the air, loud and casual. "Let's have her sit this one out," he said, pointing directly at Aaliyah. The room paused. "Don't want to overwhelm our guests with, students still learning how to shrimp properly." A few awkward chuckles followed. Aaliyah froze. She didn't speak. She didn't move. "Maybe she can help hand out water later," he added, grinning. "Got to contribute somehow, right?" A few students looked down. A couple glanced at her. But nobody spoke. The room carried on. The seminar resumed. And Aaliyah stepped back, her heart hammering in her chest. Not from anger. Not from shame. But from a deep, aching familiarity. This wasn't new. This wasn't shocking. This was just another day in a long history of being told she didn't belong, in schools, in workplaces, in friendships. She knew that look in Robert's eyes. It wasn't just superiority. It was fear. And fear always disguised itself as authority when it was threatened. She sat in the corner, back straight, eyes calm, but inside, memories rushed in. Of every coach who dismissed her, every teacher who doubted her, every boss who overlooked her. Of the time she got a scholarship offer rescinded because someone didn't believe her transcripts. Of the time she was followed around a store in her own neighborhood. Of the time a physical therapy client refused to be touched by her and asked for someone with more experience, even though she had more hours than the entire staff combined. It was all there, sitting on that mat with her. And yet, she didn't leave. She watched the seminar. She studied the movements. She traced every grip and angle in her mind. Her body still, but her spirit wide awake. She was listening. Calculating. Not revenge, not yet. But something was rising inside her. Not anger, but clarity. A clarity that comes when you see someone's mask fall and realize they were never the gatekeeper, they were just another lock, and you've always held the key. She waited. And that wait would change everything. Because soon, someone in that room, someone very important, was going to recognize her. Not for what she said. Not for how she looked. But for how she moved. For what her body remembered. For what her silence had been holding back all this time. And when that moment came, the mat, the gym, the pecking order, none of it would matter anymore. The minutes after the insult passed slowly, stretched thin by discomfort and unspoken tension. Aaliyah remained seated in the corner, her legs crossed neatly, back perfectly straight, eyes fixed on the mats but never wandering. No twitch of the brow, no twitch of her hands. Just silence. Around her, the sounds of instruction and compliance resumed as if nothing had happened. Students paired off again. The visiting instructors began demonstrating the next movement, a variation of a deep half-guard sweep, but something about the energy in the room had shifted, ever so slightly. People were still smiling, still nodding, but their eyes now flicked toward Aaliyah in short, uncertain glances. A few whispered to one another behind cupped hands, confusion replacing amusement. Something didn't feel right. Not about her. About him. One of the visiting instructors, a short, muscular man with thick forearms and a quiet disposition, kept glancing in her direction between demonstrations. His name was Professor Marcos, and though he hadn't said much, his eyes spoke fluently. While Robert joked loudly with the other guests and patted his own students on the back after clumsy executions of the sweep, Marcos stayed quiet. Observing. Measuring. He watched the way Aaliyah tracked the movement from her corner, how her fingers moved subtly in sync with the instructors, how her foot flexed with each transition, how she mimed the grips unconsciously as if rehearsing for something invisible. After the third round of drills, while Robert took a break to review footage with one of the content creators, Marcos stepped away from the main group and walked slowly toward the edge of the mat near Aaliyah. His presence wasn't aggressive. It was careful, intentional, and kind. He knelt down beside her and spoke in a soft voice, the kind reserved for when people already know the answer to the question but ask anyway out of respect. "You've trained before, haven't you?" Aaliyah turned her head, just enough to meet his eyes, and nodded once. "How long?" he asked. She hesitated, then answered plainly. "Long enough to know this isn't about technique." He sat back slightly, intrigued, almost amused, but not in a mocking way. His gaze narrowed, but his tone remained calm. "Do you want to train today?" "I came to train," she said, "but I was told to sit this one out." Marcos nodded slowly, digesting that. He looked across the room toward Robert, who was still laughing at something on a phone screen with the other instructors. Then he looked back at her. "Sometimes it takes a quiet storm to remind people what a hurricane really is," he said gently. "Will you train with me?" Her eyes held his for a breath, then she stood. No dramatic pause, no lingering stare, just a quiet, determined rise. As she tied her belt back around her waist, the whispers started again. Marcos motioned for a small open space on the mat. He signaled to the other instructors that he'd be working separately. Robert noticed, cocked his head, and shouted across the mat. "What's going on there, Professor?" Marcos raised a hand casually. "Just a warm-up roll, nothing official." Robert waved it off and turned back to the cameras. "Well, don't break anything over there. We just cleaned the mats." The sarcasm didn't hit the way it usually did. A few students near him avoided eye contact. Something was off. On the mat, Aaliyah took her stance, knees bent slightly, weight distributed with the grace of someone who knew her own body like an instrument. Marcos circled once, then engaged, no theatrics, no hand fighting, just a clean grip and flow. The exchange began smoothly, respectfully. The kind of roll where neither person tried to dominate too quickly. He tested her timing, her pressure. She responded with a calm, precise rhythm, countering his grips, redirecting his frames. It was clear, within 20 seconds, that this wasn't someone guessing her way through movements. She had structure. She had balance. She had edge. By the first minute, the tempo increased. Marcos moved with a bit more intent. She adapted instantly. His sweep attempt was met with a backstep and flawless base recovery. His pass defense was challenged by a perfectly timed hip escape. Then came the moment, a transition that took less than 3 seconds but changed everything. Marcos shot for a leg weave pass. She underhooked, redirected, and flipped into a deep sweep that ended with her in top mount, controlling the space with surgical weight distribution. He tapped the mat twice. Not from pain. From recognition. The room paused. People had started watching. The other instructors stopped mid-conversation. Students pretended to drill while sneaking glances toward the far mat. Even the cameraman shifted his lens. Robert turned, saw the ending position, and forced a loud, dismissive chuckle. "Wow, Professor Marcos, taking it easy on the white belts today, huh?" Marcos stood up slowly, nodded to Aaliyah, and walked back toward Robert with a neutral expression. "She's not a white belt," he said simply. Robert blinked. "Come again." Marcos folded his arms. "She's not a beginner. She moves with fundamentals most people don't get until brown belt." Robert let out a short laugh. "Well, I don't know where you're from, but around here, we have standards. Nobody skips the line just because they're quick on their feet." "She didn't skip anything," Marcos replied. "She waited. You just didn't see her." There was silence. Marcos turned and walked back to Aaliyah, who stood quietly on the edge of the mat. One of the visiting instructors, a tall, lean man with a slight accent, joined them. "May I?" he asked, gesturing for a roll. She nodded. The second roll was less graceful and more intense. This time, the guest came to test. He pressured her from the start, trying to pin, trying to smother. She responded like water, fluid but forceful. He attempted a knee cut, she inverted into a leg entanglement. He scrambled, she flowed into a triangle setup that almost landed. Gasps now. Eyes wide. Phones discreetly out. The whispers turned into murmurs. Who is she? Where did she come from? How did she move like that? By the time the second guest tapped, a small crowd had formed on the side of the mat. Robert stood stiff near the wall, arms folded, jaw tight. The woman he had mocked an hour earlier had now submitted 2 black belts in a row without aggression, without celebration, just undeniable, practice control. Still, she said nothing. She untied her belt and held it in her hand. Looked at it. Looked at the mat. Then placed it down again, neatly folded, and stepped back. Someone clapped. Then another. Then more. Not the kind of clapping that comes after victory. The kind that rises from truth being revealed. From something real and unshakable forcing itself into the light. Robert stepped forward, attempting to reassert control. "That's enough," he said sharply. "We still have drills to finish." Marcos turned toward him. "I think we've seen enough drills today." "I didn't approve this," Robert snapped. "You didn't need to," Marcos replied. "Sometimes excellence doesn't ask permission." The room froze again. Robert's face twitched, caught between pride and humiliation, rage and confusion. He looked at Aaliyah, who still hadn't spoken since the beginning of the seminar. He searched her face for something, guilt, defiance, apology, but found none. Just presence. Then someone asked the question no one was prepared to answer. "Wait, who is she?" A voice from the back answered. A young blue belt, barely 20, spoke without thinking. "She moves like someone who's competed before. Like, high level." All eyes turned to Aaliyah. And for the first time, she spoke, but not to defend herself. Not to explain. Just to affirm one thing. "I've been here the whole time," she said. "You just didn't see me." The room held its breath. What came next would not just change the way they saw her. It would change everything they thought they knew about the art they claimed to honor. Because her past, the one no one dared ask about, was about to speak for itself. And when it did, the very floor beneath them would never feel the same again. The silence that had swallowed the room after Aaliyah's last words wasn't just awkward, it was suffocating. The kind of silence that holds weight, like the world waiting to exhale. Everyone stood still, processing the shift they had just witnessed without truly understanding the full gravity of it. Robert's arms remained crossed, but his grip on his own elbows had tightened. His voice, when it returned, was quieter than usual, and that alone unsettled people. "That was impressive," he said finally, avoiding her eyes. "But it doesn't mean you belong here more than anyone else. Everyone has their day." Aaliyah didn't flinch. She wasn't interested in posturing. She looked toward Professor Marcos, who stood now with the other guests near the wall, watching with a tension that suggested he knew something was about to unravel. And he was right. From the back of the room, a deep voice broke the heavy air, the kind of voice that made people turn before they even understood the words. "Excuse me. Are you Aaliyah Moore?" Everyone turned. A tall, older black man in a charcoal jacket stepped into the gym. He walked with ease, confidence, a man not unfamiliar with commanding rooms without effort. The logo on his chest bore the insignia of the National Wrestling Federation. In his hands, a manila folder, sealed and clearly official. Aaliyah's jaw tensed, but only slightly. Her eyes flicked to the logo. Then to his face. She knew who he was. Coach Daniels, she said, and her voice was steady, but a new note emerged, not fear, not anxiety, but the subtle edge of something personal. He approached, nodded respectfully, and turned to the room. Sorry to interrupt, but I've been looking for you for a while. You kind of disappeared. Robert raised a hand slightly, confused and annoyed. Who are you exactly? He asked, trying to regain authority. Daniels didn't even glance at him. I'm with the National Collegiate Wrestling Association, he said, still looking only at Aaliyah. This woman right here was the #1 ranked female wrestler in her weight class for 3 consecutive years. National champion. Undefeated. She was being recruited for Olympic development before she vanished off the circuit. Whispers exploded across the room like sparks in dry grass. Even students who hadn't paid attention all day now stood frozen. Robert blinked. That can't be right. Wrestling? Here. We're talking about jiu-jitsu. Coach Daniels finally looked at him, and the look was firm but calm. Wrestling is where she built the body that just walked through your best students like warm-up drills. It's where she learned control, balance, and discipline. And it's why I came all this way to find her. Robert scoffed, searching for something to say, some sarcastic way to dismiss what had just shattered the thin illusion of his authority. She doesn't have any jiu-jitsu competition history that I know of, he said, as if it proved something. She doesn't need a resume when her body already speaks the truth, Marcos said, stepping forward. She didn't just submit 2 black belts. She dismantled their structure, step by step, with precision most brown belts take years to develop. What else do you want? Aaliyah stepped forward slowly, voice quiet, but direct. I didn't come here to prove anything, she said. I came because I missed the mat. Because after walking away from a life that stopped feeling like mine, I needed a place to breathe again. She turned to Coach Daniels. And I left because you wouldn't let me. The room was dead silent. Coach Daniels didn't flinch. I tried to push you toward greatness, he said. I didn't see how much it was costing you. You saw, she said, her tone soft but undeniable. You just didn't care. Daniels lowered his gaze slightly. I didn't come to bring you back to the circuit. I came because I saw you on a video, from this gym. I saw you being dismissed, and I saw you walk with the same presence I remember from college. And I knew then, you still had it. Aaliyah looked at the floor, the mat beneath her feet now full of weight and memory. She didn't want back what she had lost. She had already rebuilt herself from it. One of the white belts near the wall suddenly spoke, her voice hesitant. You used to be a national champion. Aaliyah turned toward her. Yeah. The girl took a slow breath. Why didn't you say anything? Because when people hear champion, they expect perfection. I just wanted to be seen as a student. Robert shook his head, his posture slowly unraveling. This is a martial arts academy, he said bitterly. We promote based on lineage and tested skill, not sob stories. Marcos turned sharply. Then promote her, he said. She's not asking for your validation, but she's earned the recognition. Robert's face burned. Are you seriously suggesting I give her a black belt based on 1 day of sparring? Marcos looked around the room, then back at Robert. No, he said. I'm saying you give her a black belt based on everything you didn't see. Everything you ignored. Everything she proved without ever needing to speak. Daniels stepped forward again. I'll say this, if she wanted to, she could walk into any professional grappling circuit tomorrow and make waves. But I think she's done fighting for other people's respect. Aaliyah nodded. That part. Robert's gaze fell on her now, nothing left in his face but the bitter outline of a man realizing the story he tried to write had been torn from his hands. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Aaliyah stepped toward the center of the mat, where her white belt still lay folded neatly. She picked it up. Then reached into her bag and pulled out something none of them had seen before, a black belt, soft from years of use, not brand new or shiny, but faded, honest. "I've had this for years," she said, voice even. "I earned it in silence. In places most of you will never know. I never wore it because I wasn't trying to be better than anyone. I was just trying to heal." She tied it around her waist slowly, deliberately. And then she said the words that would echo far beyond that gym. "You tried to erase me. But I don't disappear. I adapt. And today, I'm not asking for a belt. I'm claiming my space." Every eye was locked on her now. Not out of obligation. Not out of shock. But out of deep, humbling respect. She turned toward Marcos, and with a simple nod, he bowed. Robert didn't speak again. He didn't need to. Because in that room, on that day, the belt wasn't what changed. The story did. For a long moment, no one moved. The room held its breath as Aaliyah stood in the center of the mat, black belt tied around her waist like a quiet explosion. It wasn't defiance, not in the way people expected. There was no gloating, no dramatic performance. Just the weight of truth finally laid bare, so heavy that no one could ignore it anymore. And yet, even then, Robert's ego fought for air. His face twisted slightly as if searching for something, some shard of authority left to hold on to. He took a small step forward, hands slightly raised, his voice low but strained. "You can't just put that on and expect it to mean something here. That's not how we do things." Aaliyah turned to him, and for the first time, there was no patience left in her eyes. Just clarity. "No, you do things by keeping people small so you can feel bigger. You give stripes to students who mimic you, and you ignore the ones who challenge your comfort. But that belt doesn't need your signature. It's not about ceremony. It's about truth. And you saw it today. You saw it and still can't say it." He opened his mouth, but again, nothing came. Marcos stepped forward, standing beside her now, and the simple act made Robert's next words catch in his throat. Marcos didn't touch her, didn't say a word, just stood there, like a shield made of presence. That silent alliance between two people who understood that some wars were won without a punch thrown. Across the room, one of the younger students, Jamal, a brown belt who had trained under Robert for nearly 4 years, stepped forward cautiously. His voice cracked a little, unsure whether he had permission to speak or if permission even mattered anymore. "I watched you roll with those guys like it was muscle memory. Like you weren't even thinking, just flowing. That's the first time I've seen someone make this look like poetry." Aaliyah glanced at him, and for the first time, her expression softened. Because when you stop needing to prove yourself to people who already made up their mind, you finally move freely. There was a moment where Jamal just nodded, quietly absorbing something much bigger than technique. Then Sarah, the white belt from earlier, added, "I remember the day I walked in here and nobody even helped me tie my belt. You did. You didn't say much, but you sat next to me for 15 minutes until I got it right." Aaliyah looked down for a moment, then back up. "Because someone once did that for me. And I promised I'd do the same. Even if I was invisible while doing it." Robert took another breath, this time slower, as if trying to reset the scene in his head, to reposition himself inside a story that had spun far out of his control. "You've clearly got talent," he said, still trying to regain tone. "No one's denying that. But this isn't how we handle rankings. There's structure, lineage. You skipped steps." Aaliyah stared at him. Her voice was steady, but the emotion behind it hit with precision. "You think I skipped steps? I took every step while carrying weight you'll never have to carry. I walked through doors that weren't even open and still made room. I bled for the structure. I've been choked, slammed, dismissed, silenced, and I came back every time because I love this. But you don't get to erase what I've lived just because it didn't happen under your banner." Robert flinched, not physically, but internally. His authority, once so absolute in that space, now felt flimsy, a costume that had lost its shine. The room no longer looked to him for cues. They looked to her. Professor Daniels cleared his throat and took a step forward, his voice heavier now, less composed. I watched you wrestle back in college. I saw the way you turned pain into power. And I'm sorry. I pushed you hard, too hard. I thought molding you into a champion was the way to protect you from this world. I didn't see what it was costing you. Aaliyah's eyes flickered with something close to forgiveness, but not quite. Her voice dropped just slightly. You taught me to fight. But you never taught me to rest. Or to feel. Or to say no. He nodded, guilt unmistakable on his face. I know. And I've thought about that every year since you left. She looked away for a second, blinked slowly, and then spoke again. Rest was never a luxury for me. Not when I was the only one in the room who looked like me. I didn't get to be tired. Or unsure. I had to be perfect just to be allowed to stay. Another silence. This one different. Not heavy with awkwardness, but with shared grief. Several students lowered their eyes, the weight of her words pressing into places they hadn't let themselves feel before. Robert finally exhaled, deflated. I made a mistake, he said, softly. I let my ego run this place. I didn't see what was right in front of me. Aaliyah didn't answer. Not with words. Just a long, calm look that didn't demand apology, just acknowledgement. It was never about revenge. It was about being seen. Then, from the door, another voice, unexpected, cautious. Is it too late to sign up for the next class? Everyone turned. A young black girl stood there, maybe 16, holding a flyer with Iron Ground's logo on it. She'd walked in, probably unaware of everything she had just stepped into. But the timing was flawless. Pure. Real. Aaliyah walked over slowly and knelt in front of her. What's your name? She asked gently. Renee, the girl said, eyes wide. Well, Renee, I think this place just became worth staying in, she replied with a soft smile. Let's get you started. The moment was small, but everyone in the room felt its size. Robert looked at her again, this time with something unfamiliar in his face. Respect. I don't know if you'll stay here, he said. But if you do, I'll try to be better. I mean it. She nodded, not promising anything. You don't need to be better for me, she said. Just don't be worse for the next one. Marco stepped forward then, placing a hand on Aaliyah's shoulder. There's a black belt seminar next month in Atlanta. I want you there. As an instructor. We'll handle everything. Aaliyah's eyes locked with his. She hesitated only for a second before nodding. I'll be there. As the room began to shift back into motion, students packing up, whispering, exhaling the tension, one thing was clear. The mat had changed. Not just for that day. For good. Because when the truth finally enters the room, nothing ever rolls the same again. The gym emptied slowly, but the weight of what had taken place lingered like smoke after a fire. No one said much as they packed their bags or untied their belts. Even the ones who usually stayed behind to take selfies or film quick rolls had quietly slipped out, leaving behind a kind of reverent stillness. Aaliyah remained seated at the edge of the mat, her legs extended, arms resting behind her, staring up at the ceiling like she was watching something float above her, not a memory, not exactly, but the echo of something that had finally been released. Her chest moved steadily, not in exhaustion, but in quiet calculation, as if her body was only now catching up to everything her spirit had just carried. Across the gym, Robert stood at his desk, slowly closing his laptop, his shoulders less square than usual. He hadn't approached her again since their final exchange, and there was no telling whether his silence was born from respect, guilt, or the slow erosion of his own sense of power. Marcos lingered nearby, speaking softly with one of the other black belts, while Professor Daniels sat on the bench by the locker room, his folder unopened, fingers interlocked, watching Aaliyah in a way that suggested he saw her differently now, not because of what she'd done, but because of how she'd done it. Outside, the sky had begun to darken, the buzz of traffic muffled behind the gym's thick brick walls. The girl who had walked in earlier, Renee, was now seated next to Aaliyah, asking questions in the curious, unfiltered way only teenagers can. Aaliyah answered each one without hesitation, her voice soft, but unwavering. "How long have you been training?" "A while." "Were you scared to fight that guy?" "It wasn't about fear. It was about control." "Do you think I can be like you?" "You already are. You just haven't seen it yet." Those words settled into Renee like roots, her posture straightening, her gaze sharpening. It wasn't just inspiration. It was transmission. Aaliyah wasn't performing a role, she was handing something over, quietly, something that had taken her years to hold with both hands. Behind them, Robert watched the exchange with something that couldn't quite be named. Not jealousy. Not regret. Something closer to realization. And the thing about realization is, it doesn't always come with relief, sometimes it comes with a mirror that shows you who you've been when no one else dared to tell you. After the others had gone, and only a few lights remained on, Robert walked over. His steps were slow, not cautious, but deliberate. He didn't carry the usual air of command. No clipboard. No coffee. Just himself. He stopped a few feet from Aaliyah and cleared his throat, his eyes avoiding hers at first. "I've been thinking," he said. "About how many times I've walked past people like you without even realizing what I was walking past." She didn't interrupt. Didn't rescue him from the discomfort. He continued. "I thought discipline meant order. Structure. A clear path from white to black. I thought it meant holding the line so people wouldn't cut corners. But I didn't realize how often I used that idea to protect my own corner." Now she looked at him. Not with forgiveness, not yet, but with full attention. "You taught people how to perform," she said, "but not how to see. And seeing is harder. It means unlearning things that once made you feel in control." Robert nodded. "I know that now. Or I'm starting to." There was a beat of silence between them. Then he asked the question, the one he'd been holding all along, the one he knew might not deserve an answer. "What would it take for you to stay?" Aaliyah looked at him for a long time, her expression unreadable. "Respect," she said. "Not just for me, but for anyone who walks in here carrying more than you can see. Respect that doesn't wait for proof. Respect that listens before it judges." He swallowed hard, nodded once. "And if I can't give that?" She stood up slowly, stretching slightly as she did, and adjusted the black belt at her waist. "Then I keep moving." Her voice wasn't angry. It wasn't bitter. It was measured, full, the sound of someone who'd lived through enough to know that staying in the wrong place could cost you more than walking away ever could. But even so, something in her tone offered a window, not a door, not an open invitation, but a possibility. The kind people only earn with time, humility, and change. Robert turned and walked back toward his office, his gait slower, his hands in his pockets, not in defeat, but in quiet confrontation with himself. For a man who had spent years crafting his identity around control and lineage, he was now standing at the edge of something much harder, evolution. Later that week, Marcos sent Aaliyah the official invitation to teach at the Atlanta seminar. It came with a note handwritten on the side, "We don't need you to prove anything. Just bring who you are." She folded the paper and placed it in her drawer, then packed her bag for training. Not at Iron Ground, not yet, but at a small community dojo on the other side of town, where the mats weren't polished, but the energy was clean. She taught Renee there for the first time, drilling basic positions, body movement, and breath. The girl picked it up fast, not because she was gifted, but because someone finally believed she could be. But the dilemma, the tension that remained for Aaliyah, wasn't about belts or recognition anymore. It was about responsibility. She had taken a stand, cracked open a room, shifted the narrative. But what happens when people start looking to you for more than just inspiration? What happens when you become the symbol, the story others cling to, and the weight of that becomes its own kind of burden? In the quiet moments, Aaliyah wondered if staying away was self-preservation, or avoidance. If rebuilding somewhere else gave her freedom, or let others off the hook. Because real change didn't happen in places where everyone agreed. It happened in places like iron ground, rigid, resistant, but slowly cracking. And yet, every time she tied her black belt, she remembered the cost. The invisible wounds. The rooms that laughed while she suffered. She didn't owe anyone her return. But what if her presence could make the next girl's experience easier? What if the ripple only became a wave if someone stayed to push the tide? That question lingered with her during training, while driving home, even while washing dishes at night. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't pressure. It was the weight of possibility. The recognition that the story wasn't just hers anymore. One afternoon, a letter arrived at the dojo. No name on the outside. Just a plain envelope. Inside was a note, handwritten, shaky in parts, but deliberate. You were right. I didn't see you. I didn't want to. Because seeing you meant seeing all the ways I was failing the others. I don't expect forgiveness, but I'll keep the door open, and this time, I'll be listening. It wasn't signed. But she knew who it was from. And suddenly, the dilemma wasn't so heavy. It was a choice. And that choice would shape everything that came next. The envelope sat on Aaliyah's kitchen counter for nearly 2 days before she allowed herself to reread it. The handwriting, though unfamiliar in texture, had become all too familiar in tone. Humility, written not in apology but in intention. There was something in those final words, this time, I'll be listening, that tugged at her in a place deeper than anger could ever reach. Not because it absolved anything, but because it acknowledged everything. It was strange how such a simple sentence could echo louder than a room full of praise. Still, the question remained, what did she owe to a place that had once erased her? Did she owe it a second chance? Or was the very question built on the same flawed foundation, that forgiveness must equal return? Her answer wasn't immediate. It came slowly, layered beneath conversations, movements, breaths that carried weight. At the dojo where she now trained and taught, the air felt different. Cleaner, freer. Not because the space was better, but because she was seen. Renee had already picked up transitions with startling fluidity, and Aaliyah often caught herself smiling while the girl drilled, not because she was exceptional, but because she was unafraid to take up space. That was the real difference. No one had taught Renee to shrink. And that, more than talent, was what gave her power. One evening, after class, as they swept the mats together, Renee paused and looked up at her, her voice low but certain. Do you miss it? That other gym? Aaliyah didn't respond right away. She kept sweeping, then leaned on the handle of the broom and looked at the girl with eyes that carried more years than her face let on. I don't miss the place, she said. I miss what I thought it could be. Renee nodded slowly, chewing on the thought. Then, hesitantly, she asked, would you go back? That question lingered. Not just in that room, but in Aaliyah's bones. It followed her home. Sat with her on the edge of the bed. It wasn't about loyalty, or even pride. It was about legacy. If she walked away completely, what story would she leave behind? That it was possible to survive injustice and rebuild elsewhere. Or that the real fight, the one that mattered, was staying and shifting the system from within? Could the place that once silenced her become the very place she now used to amplify others? A few days later, she visited Iron Ground again, not during class hours, not when the students filled the space with drills and banter. She arrived just as the sun dipped behind the buildings, casting long shadows across the parking lot. The windows glowed with muted light, and through the glass, she could see the mats freshly cleaned, the racks of GIs lined neatly along the wall. The door creaked as she entered, and the familiar scent of sweat and bleach hit her like a memory too intact. Robert was there, alone, mopping the far side of the mat. He looked up, startled for a second, then set the mop aside. "You came," he said, not smiling, not hiding behind words. Just speaking plainly. "I didn't come to stay," she replied. "I came to look." He nodded, gestured toward the mat, and she stepped onto it slowly, her feet brushing against the soft surface that had once felt like battleground and sanctuary all at once. The silence between them was heavy, but not hostile. Just thick with what had never been said. He broke it first. "I've started overhauling our curriculum," he said. "Not the techniques, the culture. I realized we were teaching more than grips and passes. We were teaching hierarchy disguised as respect." She looked at him, brows slightly raised. "And what does that mean to you now?" He took a breath. "It means listening more than speaking. It means naming bias when I see it. It means making room for voices I used to ignore because they didn't sound like mine." She watched him as he spoke, trying to read between the words. She wanted to believe him, but belief doesn't come easy when trust has been broken. Still, there was something about the way he stood, not defensive, not proud, that made her stay a little longer. He added, "I want you to teach here. Not just a seminar. I want you to shape this place with your voice. I want to give you the space I should have given you from the beginning." She didn't respond. Not yet. Her eyes moved across the walls, to the photos of students, to the black belts framed with pride. So many faces. So many stories. Hers was missing from that wall, not because she hadn't earned it, but because someone had chosen not to see it. "I'm not interested in being your redemption arc," she said. "If I teach here, it's not to fix your mistakes. It's to make sure no one else carries what I carried." "I understand," he said. "And I accept that." Her silence stretched again, but this time it was thoughtful, not hard. Finally, she spoke. "If I do this, I set the terms. No tokenism. No performance. Just truth." He nodded. "Whatever you need." She stepped off the mat, walking past him toward the door. At the threshold, she paused, turned slightly. "I'll think about it." And then she was gone. The following week, she returned. Not to announce anything, not to claim space, but to train. To see if the energy had changed. And it had. Subtly, but meaningfully. The students were quieter around her, but not distant. More respectful. More aware. The jokes were softer, the drills more intentional. Jamal greeted her with a warm nod. Sarah, now a blue belt, offered to partner. And when she stepped on the mat, there was no hesitation. Just space. At the end of class, Robert asked if she'd stay for a conversation with a few of the senior students. She agreed. They sat in a circle on the mat, legs crossed, the same surface that had once been a platform of power now turned into a place of dialogue. Jamal spoke first. "I think we all watched something shift last week. Not just in the gym, but in ourselves. And I don't think we fully knew what to do with it." Aaliyah listened, nodding. "You weren't supposed to know," she said. "You were supposed to feel it. Let it challenge what you thought was normal." Another student chimed in. "How do we make sure this space stays open for people like you? Like Renee?" She leaned forward slightly, her voice low, steady. "You listen. You check your assumptions at the door. You don't wait for someone to bleed before you believe their story." They sat with that for a while. And in that stillness, something began to bloom. Not a fix. Not a clean conclusion. But the messy, essential process of collective accountability. As the class wrapped up, Robert approached her again, this time with a clipboard, not with contracts, but with the new schedule. He pointed to an empty slot. "I was thinking, if you're ready, this could be yours." She looked at the slot. "Tuesdays and Thursdays." Beginner's class. Beginners, she murmured, a faint smile touching her lips. That's where everything starts. He nodded. And sometimes, restarts. She didn't answer. Just took the clipboard, held it for a moment, then handed it back. I'll be here Thursday. Robert exhaled slowly, as if he'd been holding his breath for days. Thank you, he said, the words honest this time, not rehearsed. But she shook her head gently. Don't thank me. Earn it. And with that, she walked toward the exit, the setting sun casting a soft orange light across the mat behind her. Her steps were grounded, deliberate, like someone who had finally found the rhythm of her own story, not to rewrite the past, but to shape the future. And though the weight of what came before would never vanish, she no longer carried it alone. The door closed softly behind her. But her presence, her power, remained. The following Thursday, the dojo was filled with the quiet murmur of new students stretching, adjusting their GIs, nervously tying and readying belts that still felt foreign around their waists. There was a different energy in the room, expectant, alert, almost reverent, as if even the walls understood that something important was about to take place. Aaliyah stepped onto the mat without a grand entrance or announcement. No spotlight followed her, no titles were recited, but the second her bare feet touched the mat, the entire room seemed to exhale and still. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't just training. She was leading. And this time, not because she had something to prove, but because she had something to give. She called the class to line up, her tone calm but resonant, the way water carves rock, not by force, but by persistence. Students fumbled into rows, unsure of the formalities, but instinctively respectful. Among them was Renee, eyes bright, shoulders squared, standing near the front, her hands twitching with anticipation. Aaliyah began by demonstrating breathing exercises, guiding the class to tune into their bodies before demanding anything from them. She spoke with patience, not as someone placing herself above them, but beside them. When you step on this mat, you don't leave who you are at the door, she said, looking each student in the eye. You bring all of it, your history, your fear, your pride, your doubts. Jiu-jitsu isn't about forgetting yourself. It's about facing yourself. One of the students, a shy older man named Thomas, raised his hand and asked softly, "What if you don't like what you find?" Aaliyah paused, her gaze steady. Then you stay long enough to understand it. And you keep showing up until you learn to carry it with grace. Throughout the class, she moved among the rows, correcting posture, adjusting grips, offering quiet words of encouragement. Her corrections were never loud or performative. They were personal, delivered with care and specificity. And the more she poured into her students, the more the room transformed, not just in skill, but in energy. By the end of class, they moved with a rhythm that wasn't synchronized, but unified. Not perfect, but connected. After bowing out, students lingered longer than usual, hesitant to leave the space they had just helped create. Renee hung back, eyes glowing with a mixture of excitement and awe. She approached Aaliyah slowly, gripping the edge of her belt. "You made it feel like I belonged here," she said, her voice low, thick with something unspoken. Aaliyah crouched slightly to meet her eye level. "You do. And no one gets to make you doubt that again, not even yourself." Renee threw her arms around her in a brief, impulsive hug before pulling away quickly, slightly embarrassed. Aaliyah just smiled and nodded, letting the moment breathe. As the students filtered out, Robert entered the space quietly, dressed in plain clothes, holding a clipboard but not pretending to be in charge. He watched for a few minutes from the doorway, then approached with measured steps. When he finally spoke, it was less about authority, more about accountability. "I saw the whole class," he said. "They didn't just learn technique. They learned to respect the mat. And each other." Aaliyah nodded slightly, her face unreadable. "That's the real curriculum." He hesitated, then added, "You were right to make it about the beginning. That's where it all went wrong for me. I was too focused on the end, belts, ranks, status. I forgot how we get there matters even more. She didn't soften. She didn't cut him off. She let the silence stretch, demanding honesty. I used to think leadership was about being followed, he said finally. But now I see it's about making others feel strong enough to lead themselves. Aliyah crossed her arms, her posture relaxed, but firm. Leadership is about creating spaces where people don't have to become someone else to be respected. You didn't just forget that, you built a system against it. He nodded, absorbing the blow without flinching. I know. And I'll spend every class proving I've changed. She didn't offer praise or comfort. She didn't need to. Growth doesn't require applause, it requires consistency. In the weeks that followed, the dojo began to shift in ways both subtle and profound. More students from different backgrounds began to show up. Not just black students, but queer students, older women, single parents, immigrants, people who once might have assumed they wouldn't belong in such a space. And slowly, Iron Ground became something else. Not a perfect place, but a present one. A place where inclusion wasn't a mission statement, it was a muscle that had to be worked, strained, and rebuilt daily. One evening, after another beginner class, Aliyah found herself alone on the mat, stretching out her legs as the lights dimmed overhead. Professor Daniels walked in, not as a recruiter, but as an old coach checking in on someone he'd once pushed too hard. He sat across from her, legs crossed, silent for a beat before speaking. I saw the video from the seminar. You didn't just win that day. You taught. She raised an eyebrow, a hint of a smile teasing her lips. I've been teaching my whole life. People just didn't always realize it. He chuckled softly, then grew serious. I've had a lot of time to think about how I handled your journey. I was so focused on making you the best that I didn't see what you needed to stay whole. Aliyah looked at him, her eyes soft but firm. I used to be angry at you. Then I realized you were just doing what the world taught you, that success was survival. That we couldn't afford softness. But survival isn't the same as healing. And I want healing now. Daniels lowered his head for a moment, then nodded. You found your way without me. But if you ever want to build something together again, something different, something better, I'm ready to follow your lead. She didn't respond right away. She let the invitation settle, feel real, not rushed. Finally, she said, maybe. If we're building for the next generation, not just trying to correct the past. The weight of that landed between them not as a burden, but a shared responsibility. Later, as she walked home under a quiet sky, the evening air cool against her skin, Aliyah felt something she hadn't felt in years, equilibrium. Not peace, not quite. But balance. The feeling of being whole in the presence of what once broke her. She wasn't done. The fight would always exist. But now she had ground beneath her feet. A place to teach, to grow, to be. And most importantly, she had made that place herself. Not through compliance. But through presence, power, and truth. Months passed, and the once rigid rhythm of Iron Ground had reshaped itself into something living, evolving, breathing. The white walls that had once served as silent witnesses to exclusion now bore murals painted by local artists, images of strength, unity, and identity. Where rows of trophies had once stood untouched and unchallenged, a new wall emerged, not for accolades, but for stories. Printed testimonials, handwritten reflections, anonymous notes from students old and new who had found a sense of belonging they didn't know they were allowed to have. Aliyah never claimed ownership of these changes. She never asked for her name to be added to the plaques or highlighted in marketing. But her fingerprints were everywhere, in the structure, in the silence that now made space for others to speak, in the confidence of voices that used to whisper but now stood grounded and unafraid. She had taken on the Tuesday and Thursday beginner classes full-time, but the line between student and teacher blurred beautifully in her sessions. Her room wasn't ruled by hierarchy, it was held by connection. Students began to stay after class just to talk, sometimes about technique, other times about life. Renee, now wearing a solid gray belt and leading warm-ups, had become not just a student, but a reflection of what this space could be when it was honest. Her strength wasn't in her transitions or her takedowns, it was in her newfound ability to walk into a room like she belonged there, without asking for permission. Robert, for his part, did what many never expected, he stayed. He didn't run from the discomfort. He began each advanced class with 10 minutes of discussion, inviting students to reflect not just on their practice, but on their presence. He dismantled the old ranking process and created a committee to ensure promotions were based on holistic growth, not just performance. He admitted to things in front of his students that most instructors would bury. He apologized, often and publicly, and not just once. It became a practice. And while not everyone accepted it, everyone respected the consistency. His authority no longer came from control, it came from vulnerability, from the quiet power of a man learning to rebuild from the inside out. Professor Daniels went on to launch a mentorship initiative for young wrestlers who'd left the sport due to burnout or discrimination. He asked Aaliyah to help design its structure, and though she declined to be a face of the program, she sent several students his way, ones who needed someone like him, but evolved. He never pushed for more than she offered, and in that restraint, they found a new kind of trust. Not the rigid trust of coach and athlete, but the flexible, earned trust of two people who had learned too late but still chose to change course. The most surprising transformation, perhaps, came not in the dojo, but in the community beyond its walls. News of the incident and Aaliyah's story had quietly spread, at first through whispered admiration in martial arts forums, then in features on podcasts, eventually making its way to articles exploring racial and gender equity in combat sports. But Aaliyah never chased that spotlight. She accepted only one interview, an audio piece for a local community radio station. When asked why she spoke at all, she said simply, "Because the silence isn't safe." It never was. Her words resonated far beyond martial arts. Schools reached out. Youth programs. Women's shelters. Organizations who had never considered jiu-jitsu as a tool for healing now wanted her guidance. She began offering free self-defense classes once a month at the community center, not flashy workshops, but slow, trauma-informed sessions rooted in awareness and reclamation. People came in broken, anxious, unsure. They left a little taller. A little steadier. They didn't leave warriors. They left whole. One Thursday night, after a long class, Aaliyah stood alone on the mat, lights dimmed, music off. The room was still. She closed her eyes, barefoot, breathing deep. Not searching. Not defending. Just being. Then she heard soft footsteps. Renee stood at the edge of the mat, holding a folder. "I finished my essay," she said, walking over. Aaliyah opened the folder. The title read, "The Fight That Found Me." "It's for college apps," Renee said. "They asked me to write about a challenge I overcame. But I didn't want to write about what happened to me. I wanted to write about what I became because of it." Aaliyah didn't speak. She read slowly. Every word carried weight. Every paragraph held echoes of their journey, both shared and separate. At the end, Renee had written, "You don't have to win to be victorious. You just have to stay. And believe you're worth fighting for." When Aaliyah looked up, her eyes glistened, not with pride, but with something quieter, peace. "You're ready," she whispered. "For college?" Renee asked. "For all of it." Later that night, as Aaliyah locked the front door of the dojo, she paused, staring up at the sign above. It still read Iron Ground. But to her, it would always mean something different now. Not strength through dominance, but through resilience. Not foundation as tradition, but as transformation. And maybe the most powerful part of the whole story wasn't how it ended, but that it didn't. Because this wasn't an ending. It was a return. A reckoning. A rewriting. And so to you, listening to this story, what did you feel? Did you see yourself in Aaliyah? In Renee? In Robert? Were there moments you were uncomfortable? Moments you were moved? Because if so, you're doing the work. You're in the process. This story isn't about martial arts. It's about space. About who gets to take it. About who gets asked to shrink, and who decides to expand anyway. So now I ask you, what space have you been told doesn't belong to you? And what would happen if you stepped into it anyway? If this story moved something in you, share it. Reflect on it. Talk about it. And don't forget to leave a comment. We want to hear what this meant to you, how it made you feel, what it made you remember. And if you believe in stories that challenge, uplift, and twist the narrative, make sure to subscribe to Tales of Twist. Because this story is just one of many. And yours might be next.